In this module, I want to address the vital question: is globalization on balance good, or whether it's bad? But I want to start first by going back to 1989, when Francis Fukuyama published his article, The End of History. Fukuyama believed that with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the history would end. In the article, which was then expanded into a book publication, Fukuyama argued that humankind had reached its final stage of cultural and ideological and political evolution. So by end of history, Fukuyama did not mean that events would stop happening. Rather, he meant that humankind had reached its logical end of its political history, and that all other societies and nations would become like the West, would also become liberal democratic, would also adopt free market capitalism. And Fukuyama believed that this was inevitable, as these liberal democratic free market arrangements matched human nature. And Fukuyama's publication really exemplifies the triumphalist, optimistic way of thinking in the 1990s. Even more optimistic than Fukuyama, because Fukuyama had some reservations regarding this end of history, was Thomas Friedman, who published a very influential, best-selling book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. The Lexus symbolized modernity and globalization, and the olive tree symbolized identity. And in the book, he posited what he called Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. And Friedman argued that no two countries that have those golden arches, that in other words have McDonald's chain, will ever go to war with one another, because such countries, he called them McDonald countries, do not want to fight wars. Their citizens prefer to stand in line for burgers. Now, this idea, a variant of what we call capitalist peace theory, has been challenged, has been contradicted by several conflicts, including the war between Israel and Lebanon, and wars between Russia and Georgia, and between Russia and Ukraine in the years following the publication of the book. But what I think is even more problematic is the idea that he advanced in his later publication, The World is Flat, in which he transformed this concept of the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention into the Dell laptop theory of conflict prevention. Here he argued that no two countries that are part of this extremely complex global supply chain of Dell would ever want to lose their place in the chain for the sake of a military conflict. Pessimistic accounts of globalization started being published as soon as optimistic ones. And I want to focus on one particularly influential contribution to those pessimistic evaluations of globalization. It's a contribution by sociologist George Ritzer. He draws on ideas of late 19th century, early 20th century German thinker Max Weber, and particularly his ideas about rationalization and bureaucracy. Bureaucracy was the structure promoting rationalization, which, according to Weber, was inevitable, but that he was also very concerned about, because he believed it emptied the world of any meaning. For Weber, the model of rationalization was bureaucracy. For Ritzer, it's fast food McDonald's restaurant. And Ritzer defines what he discusses as McDonaldisation as the process by which the principles of the fast food restaurant are coming to dominate much of the world. So let's have a look at those principles and why Ritzer is quite pessimistic about their expansion worldwide. So the first principle of McDonaldisation is efficiency. And I think that's quite uncontroversial. Fast food restaurants are clearly efficient. Employees prepare meals in an assembly-like fashion, and customers acquire and consume those meals quickly and efficiently. And as Ritzer says, this is maximized in case of drive-through window. The second principle of McDonaldisation is calculability and emphasis on quantity. So various aspects of the employees' work are timed, and there is emphasis on speed, which, according to Ritzer, has negative impact on the quality of the products. And of course, customers are expected to spend as little time as possible in the fast food restaurants. Of course, the drive-through window reduces the time spent in the restaurant to 0. The third principle of McDonaldisation is predictability. And this means that wherever in the world you go to a McDonald's restaurant, you will see the same interior, you will be able to purchase exactly the same products. The fourth principle says that there is a high degree of technological control over both employees but also over customers. And Ritzer predicts that while increasingly technologies are dominating employees, they will eventually be replacing them altogether. And this last point is related to the fifth principle of McDonaldisation, namely its irrationality. And in a paradoxical way, this drive to rationalization, revolving around these principles just discussed, ultimately produces irrational outcomes. Employees of McDonald's work in dehumanizing conditions, hence very high rates of dissatisfaction, and consumers eat meals that are both unhealthy and eaten in dehumanizing conditions, in their cars, on the move. And ultimately, one of the main irrationalities of the system is that when technology replaces employees, then there will be perhaps no incomes that would allow the public to consume McDonald's products. McDonaldisation, I'm sure you can see that, is a pessimistic account of globalization. It suggests this depressing sameness, depressing uniformity, cultural homogenization spreading around the world. Because what should be noted is that while Ritzer chose McDonald's as this best example of the processes that he associates with globalization, he talks also about similar trends taking place in other areas of our lives. So there may be Mac hotels, Mac television channels, Mac universities. More and more of our lives are dominated by those principles. In his later work, Ritzer also introduces a thought-provoking concept of globalization of nothing. And by nothing, he means forms that are really devoid of any specific meaning. So a shopping mall is a form of nothing, whereas it could be contrasted with a village market, which is a form of something. And Ritzer explains that nothing can be globalized quite easily because it's easy to replicate, cheap, to reproduce exactly because it doesn't have this distinctive meaning. It also won't clash with local forms. And again, this is quite a pessimistic, depressing view of globalization. Now, perceptions of cultural homogenization can be exaggerated, and frequently, together with Ritzer's contribution, an ethnographic study of McDonald's in Moscow is discussed, published by Shannon Peters Talbot. And the study demonstrated that at that particular time, at least, in Moscow, McDonald's did not conform to any of the principles discussed by Ritzer. So instead of efficiency, there were long queues and lingering. Instead of being inexpensive, an average McDonald's meal cost as much as a third of the daily wage of an average Russian worker. It was not predictability that attracted Russian customers, but rather uniqueness and novelty. Also, many standard items were not actually available in the McDonald's in Moscow. And the customers were not expected to be as efficient as discussed in Ritzer's account of McDonaldisation. They were allowed to stay in the restaurant for longer time, to spend time just over their meal, or perhaps even just their tea. The example of McDonald's in Moscow, which I think may be a bit problematic, we could ask the question to what extent McDonald's has remained so peculiar and different in Moscow than in other locations around the world. But I think a more general point is made here, that global corporations will often try to adjust to local circumstances. And this is captured in the term glocalisation. It was introduced to business studies and management by Japanese Sony chairman. But glocalisation was then popularized by Roland Robertson in sociology, Robertson, whose history of globalization we already discussed. And the concept stands for this interaction between the global and the local. It emphasizes that there need not be a clash between globalization and localization, that these two trends, processes, local cultures and global forms interact in often very creative ways. I think you could think of popular music, you could think of hip-hop and this global format that then gets filled in with quite distinctive local content, depending on where exactly in the world you look. So cultural hybridization is an optimistic view of globalization. It views the process as very creative, as producing those mixed hybrid forms that are extremely interesting, that also revitalize local culture in various ways. This is a way of thinking about globalization that Ritzer believes is romanticized and perhaps also in some cases only available to the wealthy middle class consumers of culture. I would like to now turn to the final module in this talk that also focuses on the question of cultural globalization, but emphasizes cultural difference, the idea that cultures cannot be really brought together in a creative way, that interaction of different cultures always causes conflict. And based on that, I will very briefly conclude by reflecting on what this means for the future of globalization.